Recording in progress.
Well, welcome everyone. It's great to see you all here at our meeting today, and thank you all for braving this weather to get here because it was a little bit dicey out there today. And those of you who are online, not too many, but our speakers are. So, and I'll be introducing you in a moment. But first, I'd like to check and see, do we have any visitors or new members here today? Okay, we don't today. Well, I'm not surprised considering. Anyway, I'm very excited to introduce our speakers today. These were referred to me by Emily, who knows them out in Tennessee. And our first speaker is Jacob Benner. He's an ichnologist, works with trace fossils and has worked in rocks and sediment as old as the Ordovician and as young as the Pleistocene, with the goal of locating and describing unique animal behaviors represented in the trace fossil record as a path toward a more complete understanding of the function, diversity, and evolution of ancient ecosystems. He is currently a distinguished lecturer in Earth, Environmental, and Planetary Sciences at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Jake's been teaching geoscience for over 23 years at the college level, and he holds an undergraduate degree from Cornell College in Iowa and an MS degree from the University of Utah. Our other speaker, R.J. Richard Knecht, is a paleobiologist and evolutionary ecologist that focuses primarily on terrestrial systems of the Paleozoic, with a primary emphasis on early hexapods. Knecht earned a BS in geology from Tufts University, where he worked on several research projects, including the paleoecology of a late Carboniferous intermontane basin, paleoecology and paleobiogeography of the Pleistocene. I'm going to miss this. Certain Pleistocene fossils. Sorry, I'm not going to try that one. Using chronostratigraphy, got it, and the paleobiology of a Carboniferous sponge forest before spending the next several years working in the collections of the invertebrate and invertebrate paleontology departments at Harvard's Museum of Comparative Zoology. He then resumed his education and completed an MS in geology from the University of New Hampshire, Durham, where he used resurrection ecology and the recovery of subfossil Amphibia, resting eggs of freshwater zooplankton, to examine the structure, drivers, and limits of competition and coexistence in a natural system. Knecht is currently a doctoral candidate in Organismic and Evolutionary Biology and associate at the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard University. He will start a new role in May as a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology and Museum of Paleontology at the University of Michigan. He's also a research affiliate of the Turkana Basin Institute in Kenya. So their topic today is early Pennsylvanian Lagerstätte in Massachusetts reveals a diverse ecosystem on a subhumid alluvial fan. And they gave me a mouthful of words to say there. So anyway, I'm very pleased that you're here today to speak to us, and I'm going to turn this over to you.
Thanks, Terry, and sorry we made you read all that. I apologize.
Oh, no, that's quite all right.
Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
All right. So first off, I'm Jake Benner. I'll be batting lead off here on this presentation and talking about the background of this project about Lagerstätte that we kind of discovered in the middle of southeastern Massachusetts from the Carboniferous. And then I'm going to turn it over to my good friend and colleague, R.J. Knecht, who's going to discuss the fossil content of this deposit. But I don't want to get started without, again, thanking Emily for inviting us. This is a great opportunity to sort of spread the word about what we do and connect with a really great group that's not too far away from me here in Knoxville. Okay, so we can't get anywhere without help from other people. So I just wanted to start this off with the acknowledgments instead of saving them for the end. This project started way back in 2007. That's been almost 20 years now. And it started because of when I worked at Tufts University, there were students who needed undergraduate student research projects. And my colleague, Ann Gardolski, who you see in the photo there on the left, who's a stratigrapher, opted to take students out to this Carboniferous basin in southeastern Massachusetts to get her students involved in more research. And through that connection, I learned that some of her students had read a paper that described some amphibian trackways or footprints in these very same rocks. And so I started going out with them to take a look at this particular rock formation. Now, eventually we partnered with other people in the region whose names you can see there, people like Meg Thompson and Dan Murray, who have extensive experience in these basins for different reasons, the structural understanding of the basin, the volcanic history of the basin, and even the history of coal deposits in the basin. Now, of course, RJ, who you see there in the middle of that photo as a much younger man, went off to do many different things after he graduated from Tufts University. And he put this project on pause until he started his dissertation at Harvard. And that's where we sort of took it all up again and began really more deeply investigating the fossil content of this deposit. So thanks to all these people, the people you see in the quadrant, the bottom right quadrant there of the table, are all the people that participated in helping us understand exactly what we're looking at in this deposit, because it's so diverse that no one person really has the expertise to understand everything that we're seeing. Okay, so this is our trajectory for the talk. We're going to give you some background about the Wamsutta Formation, which is the focus of the talk, and then we'll dive into the fossils and finish up by just concluding some things about terrestrial ecosystem diversity, comparing this deposit to other deposits of similar age. Here's where we are on the map. We're talking about a place in southeastern Massachusetts that is not far from Boston. If you've ever been to the New England region, you'll remember that Providence, Rhode Island, is not too far from Boston, just south of this little star. That's where the Narragansett Basin is in Massachusetts. It's a sequence of Devonian, volcanic, and sedimentary rocks all the way through the latter part of the Carboniferous, with an unconformity between the Devonian and the Pennsylvanian. So we essentially lack Mississippian rocks in these basins. All of the deposition there tends to be terrestrial, which we'll discuss in a little bit more detail. And because it's in New England and because of the density of universities in the region, this basin has actually been studied for a long time, about 150 years. I just want to impress upon you that this is an urban geology project, too. This is a Google Maps view of the area of study, and it's right along the Route 1 corridor that leads from Boston to Providence, Rhode Island. And I put the arrow there at the top that you see up here. It's only about a mile from Gillette Stadium where the Pats play football. Now, within all of this urban development, there are patches of open land, and it's on these patches of open land that we've been able to sort of undertake this work with the permission of the private landowners in this area. So a little background. I mentioned this basin's been studied for a long time. Back in the 1890s, it got the monographic treatment by the USGS, and the reason for that is because in one of the rock formations of this basin, there were mineable deposits of coal in a rock formation called the Rhode Island Formation. Along with that coal extraction, of course, they discovered at the time plant fossils as well as some insect fossils that were studied by local scientists. But at that time, in general, the Wamsutta Formation, the formation we're going to talk about in this basin, was pretty much ignored. Fast forward in time to the 20s through the 40s, there's renewed interest in the Wamsutter Formation, basically because it had been ignored for a while. A student took up a project, Arthur Cleves, to sort of describe the stratigraphy of this rock formation, and that's who first discovered the presence of amphibian tracks in that formation, and that was published way back in 1930. A little later in time, folks wanted to get a better age assessment of these rocks that were distinct from that Rhode Island formation that contained coal. So somebody undertook more floral studies and linked those rocks to rocks of approximately the same age in the Canadian Maritimes. So here we're talking Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, the basins, the large carboniferous basins that are up there, they're approximately that same age. Fast forward in time to the 70s through the 80s, the USGS undertook another big study of this basin because of the energy crises during the 1970s. They were very concerned about finding or becoming more energy independent, potentially using the coal remaining in this basin as a resource. So they put a scientist named Paul Lyons on this project. He did a massive amount of mapping and also core drilling and interpretation that gave us new floral ages for the rocks and even better correlations. Okay, a little bit about the tectonic setting of these basins, because that's going to become important in our understanding of the value of the fossils here. We think that during the late Devonian, and this isn't shown on the figure that I'm showing here, but during the late Devonian, these basins begin their earliest rifting. That was shown more recently by Meg Thompson and Don Hermes back in 2002. And they established the age of some volcanic rocks of 372 million years old, late Devonian rocks at the bottom of that basin. So that gives us an understanding that these basins were opening at least that early, and then they began to fill with sediments. Now, the context of the later basin fill is shown in the diagram here. Of course, we have Gondwana colliding with Laurentia, and that collision, the subduction and collision, is sort of at an oblique angle. And that's important because it opens up the Narragansett Basin, or continues to open the Narragansett Basin in a very particular way that allows sediment to sort of pour in from the surrounding catchments into this basin. So our particular rocks are part of the early late Carboniferous in terms of their age, and I'll discuss how we understand their age. But this particular period of time is when those sediments are filling the basin. Note that part of the collision, of course, of Gondwana with Laurentia involves the building of the Appalachian mountains, and of course the Alleghenian fold thrust belt, sort of that ultimate stage of Appalachian mountain building. So that's sort of the context of these sediments. Now, this particular basin in Massachusetts, and these might be more fun maps to look at. They're from Ron Blakey's excellent work, sort of giving life to these paleogeographic maps that we often present. He has carefully altered the paleogeography with real looking topography, and it helps us kind of understand the actual environments that we're looking at here. So I've tried to highlight in yellow where Massachusetts is in all of this tectonic collision activity. So here we've got the Devonian in the first plate on the far left. It's part, Massachusetts at the time is part of what we call the Acadian orogeny. So there's already a mountain belt there. And as we fast forward through the Mississippian and the Pennsylvanian, you notice that Massachusetts stays right near the axis of these growing mountain belts. So when we use this word intramontane basin, we really mean a basin that is situated within a mountain belt. And you notice at no time is there any direct connection to this particular basin, and we think this is true, to the marine environment. And that's an interesting situation. All right, so zooming in on the map here, here's the Narragansett Basin that we're going to be looking at. Here's Providence. Boston is at the top of the screen there. Um, there are two basins in this area. One is the big one, the Narragansett Basin. There's also one called the Norfolk Basin that is less well studied and has less outcrop area, but both of them contain this Carboniferous sequence. And on the edges, this has all been mapped. On the edges, they are bounded by faults with the pre-Paleozoic basement. So most of the basement rock surrounding this area is Proterozoic or earlier in age. Here's the geologic map. If you see the green here that says Narragansett Basin, that's the basin we were just looking at shaded in gray. What I want to point out is that all of the green here is the Rhode Island Formation, which is a fluvio-lacustrine sequence of rocks. There's a lot of black shale in that rock formation, a lot of fern fossils and things like that. But if you look way up here in the northwest corner of the Narragansett Basin, this pink stippled color, that is the Wamsutta Formation, which is very different in its character from the younger Rhode Island Formation. So this is primarily where we work to locate and extract our fossil content. This is what we think the basin stratigraphy is. Notes we're here in the Pennsylvanian. The orange is the Wamsutta Formation that we're going to be looking at. Note that it is older for the most part than the Rhode Island Formation that fills the basin plus more later in the history of the basin. There are a couple of other formations of interest. The Pondville Formation is a huge boulder conglomerate. And when I say boulder conglomerate, we're talking about boulders that are a meter or more in size. Right on top of that is the Wamsutta Formation. And then later in time, there's another conglomerate formation that comes in from the west. What do these rock formations look like? This is what they look like. This is basically the best exposure of the Wamsutta Formation in the whole basin. And it's located in the parking lot of a strip mall. Remember, I mentioned this is an urban setting and it's really hard to access and find these rocks where they haven't been paved over, somebody's house built directly on them. So this is what we've got to sort of understand the stratigraphy, at least today. And what you'll notice about these rocks that's kind of interesting is that they are essentially layer upon layer alternating conglomerate with sandstone and shale units that are thinner in between. And that's pretty interesting. Most of these conglomerates are huge tabular in three-dimension conglomerates that have erosional bases with the sediments below. And we think the origin of these conglomerates, and prior geologists have agreed that these are conglomerates generated in the medial to distal areas of an alluvial fan. And the sandstone and shale units, because they lack any indicators of permanence or flowing water like a river or stream, we think those are the result of flooding at the base of the fan, where water accumulates and maybe some water washed off of the fan brings some sediment and it's allowed to settle from suspension, and then it dries out later. And I'll show you some evidence for that. This is just a close-up of the contact between that conglomerate. Here's a field notebook for scale, and you can see the size of these particular conglomerate pebbles. They're not the boulder size like the Pondville conglomerate, but they are of significant size, and that's the erosion of that sandstone and shale layer below. Importantly, the sandstone and shale layers are where we find all of our fossils. Close-up of the sandstone and shale in cross-section looks like this. Basically, these are sand-shale couplets where we've got, we think, settling from suspension of the sand grains in a pool of water that is relatively ephemeral at the base of an alluvial fan, and then later silt and clay settling out on top to create a mudstone. And those are the darker layers that you see in the cross-section here. Now, what you'll notice is when you're looking at the bedding planes of these sand shale units, they're rich with mud cracks, and you can see evidence for those mud cracks being ripped up by later flooding events in the presence of these mud chip breccias here. And you can also see evidence of loading of heavier sediment onto already soft and squishy sediment below. This is the model I want you to think of when we're talking about the fossils. This is the environment in which these organisms were all living. We're here in this intramontane basin. We've got the mountain belt nearby, and the mountains are shedding sediment in the form of and creating the forms of these alluvial fan lobes. And down near the end of the fan, you've got the medial area of the fan that might be active with sedimentation. But then you've got the distal portion of the fan where it kind of spreads out into the valley floor. Maybe it meets a lake down below. That connection to the lake and also to the regional water table is really important. Don't forget, along with the sediments being shed, water is being fed into the alluvial fan and it's sinking down into the fan surface and then creating at the water table or near it little springs at the base of the fan that allow plants to thrive and survive. So some people have suggested that you may even get coal forming in these spring-like environments at the edge of the fan near lake shoreline. We don't see any coal in our deposits. We see all the carbon in our deposits has been oxidized and lost, but we do see evidence for forestation of these fan surfaces and then floods that maybe grab a hold some of that vegetation and send it down the fan to be deposited in ephemeral pools near the distal fan end. Okay, what's it look like when you're out there? In this urban area, again, it's really hard to find exposures, so we have to really rely on open space. And the landowner of this particular open space has allowed us since 2007 to go out to the land and basically chip away with hand tools to collect all of our fossils. That's one of the reasons this work is so difficult, is because we're not really able to use any power tools out here to expose rock. And you can see in the photo on the left, that's RJ in the distance there. That's the landscape that we're dealing with. It's heavily forested. It was deforested at one time, and this is secondary growth. It's heavily forested, and oftentimes there are soil horizons sitting on top of the rocks that we're trying to excavate. And the picture on the right shows a pretty typical excavation of some of these sand and shale units. We are literally getting small portions of rock one at a time out of these rock formations, out of the Wamsutta formation. And every time we pull out a new bedding plane, we're inspecting it, inspecting the surface for these trace fossils that RJ is going to be telling you about. Last bit I'm going to talk about is the age of the Wamsutta formation, because that's so important for the value of the fossil content, knowing the age of the rocks. So I mentioned before that there's been a long history of study here. Some of those have dealt with the plant fossils in order to get a good age estimate. So I just want to show you how that age estimate has changed over time through reevaluating plant fossils, given our new understandings over time, as well as the collection of more plant fossils like we've done very recently. So Knox, way back in 1944, said these rocks were early Muscovian in age. For those of you who are familiar with the Westphalian time scale, that's Westphalian C. Lyons, Paul Lyons, the USGS employee who worked really hard to map all these rocks and in the process gained an education in plant stratigraphy, he thought that these rocks were right at the border between the Muscovian and the Bashkirian, maybe about 315 million years. Later came along Paul Lyons, but with a partner who was actually an avocational paleontologist named Bob Sproul, who had been collecting fossils in the basin for quite a long time, and he was particularly enamored with plants. And Bob is actually somebody that RJ and I have worked with, following his work with Paul Lyons. But Bob and Paul decided, well, with a bigger collection of fossils, we are better able to estimate the age at being late Bashkirian. So it's getting older over time, you notice. And then finally, with the collection that RJ was able to put together with a bunch of other people's help, including Bob, they finally determined that it's actually older than everybody thought it was, because we've been able to find more datable plant taxa. And that put it squarely in the mid-Bashkirian time. And that's about 320 to 318 million years. The other thing I want to point out is that because the age of this rock formation has gotten older, it has also made the fossil content, interestingly, older than most of the coal measures that we're familiar with from the Carboniferous. It wasn't until about the Duckmantian that we started seeing rapid accumulation of peat that would eventually turn to coal in a lot of the basins, especially in the eastern US. Now, with the work that we've done, the Wamsutta is even older than the coal measures, which is an interesting glimpse of life into a slightly different environment than we see with the coal measures, representing a completely different climate as you sort of go down the road there in the Pennsylvanian. Okay, so I'm going to sort of check out and let RJ take over the presentation from here.
Thank you, Jake. 1 second while I switch this over. Okay, can everyone see the screen?
Yes.
All right, great. So we're finally getting closer to actually looking at fossils, which would be nice. All right, first I just wanted to talk real quickly about Lagerstätte because this is a Lagerstätte, and Lagerstätte is a term that's often in the literature and kind of, it seems a goal that a lot of people want their sites to be Lagerstätte, of course, because of the importance, but what really is a Lagerstätte? Um, and and the general term is, the general concept is that Lagerstättes are sites of exceptional preservation. And they come in two flavors, basically. You have concentration Lagerstätte, which have an enormous amount of fossils, or you might have conservation Lagerstätte, which have a very specific, particular type of preservation. So, for example, um, soft tissue preservation, or something along those lines, where it's just really exceptional. And then it's about the quality, not the quantity. Um, Very common, famous ones that we all know about. You have Burgess Shale in Canada, with the Cambrian soft body preservation, including internal anatomy of that site. The Solnhofen in Germany, Jurassic site with the famous Archaeopteryx, the first feathered dinosaur, and of course the Green River Formation in America, which is vast in size and beautifully contains this freshwater deposits from the Eocene. Now, all of these, again, are very well known, but they're all body fossil dependent. So we can look at these and say, yes, they have a large number of fossils and they're well preserved, or they preserve certain things. And before I go on and start talking about the next part, I also want to point out, though, as much as these are special deposits, and they are, there's actually over 700 Lagerstätte currently, and that number is continuously growing. We think of a site like Burgess Shale, and we think, wow, that's really exceptional and unusual, but actually there's a whole bunch from that time period that are very similar. In fact, and in some cases might even be better. That's our more well-known example. But again, going back to the concept of these are all body fossil Lagerstätte. What about trace fossil Lagerstätte? Which is what we're talking about here, because we are dealing with mostly the great majority of what we're going to look at are trace fossils. And so you can't use body fossils in the same type of definition. So with ichthyofossil Lagerstätten, we are looking for exceptional sites of preservation and abundance, and it's mostly superficial trace fossils. That's kind of the evolved definition of trace fossil Lagerstätte. And examples of that would be the Robledo Mountains or the Union Chapel mine, both which have really extensive vertebrate tracks and trackways, which are probably most well known for both those sites. Although they do have also a variety of invertebrate tracks and trails as well. But let's get to the Wamsutta, what we're actually talking about here and what we're recovering. So this is an example of one of the drawers on the far left that we have. In the museum right now, we have about 4,000 slabs of rock that we've pulled from here. And you've seen how we've had to kind of break them apart. So we're not getting always these huge slabs. Sometimes we're getting really small stuff. Um, but the amount of information that's on every surface is enormous. So this center picture you're looking at is a 5 centimeter by 4 centimeter slice of the surface. On the right-hand side, I took that same image and I started tracing the different ichnogenera. So here you can see the vertebrate track. The yellow, the white, and the red are invertebrate ichnogenera, different ones, different types of tracks and trails. And then over here in green, where you see these little dashes, that's actually a partial full body insect impression, where these are actually the individual legs of an insect. So, and there's even some that I've missed here, but you can see the vast level of information that's on here. This allows us to go really in depth in understanding what's happening in the environment. Now I'll start to show you guys some of the vertebrates, and then we'll talk about invertebrates, plants, and some of the interactions between those groups. Now, again, this is a very common piece that you would see at the site. And I want to show this to emphasize the fact that we are not able to, unlike some of these other sites, at least not yet. We might branch into this soon, but we're not able to expose these large bedding surfaces and then break apart the rock. And if we did, we'd be able to get really extensive tracks and trails. But if you look over here on the left, you can see that we have a pez, we have a footprint, we also have a tail drag, we have these raindrop impressions that are here. We have a lot of data. It's just a matter of trying to get to it in terms of big picture things. So when I'm going to show you the vertebrates, we're focusing mostly on tracks and track pairs. We do have some trackways, but until we actually get better exposure, we're not going to get these really beautiful ones. And it also preconditions us to highlight the smaller stuff. Because we do have larger tracks that are on the size of a softball glove for one hand. We just haven't been able to actually expose that kind of stuff and get the long trackways. Now, this particular picture is is one of my favorites, and it's because it's the very first fossil we actually broke at the site when we went there looking for fossils. So Jake spoke about how we went back to the site because in the 1930s there was mention that there were some tracks there, and it turns out that those vertebrate tracks that they identified were actually invertebrate tracks. But we were searching all day, couldn't find anything. It was starting to get towards dark, and we were about to leave. And this was the very last rock picked up. One more. It split open, and there you can see these beautiful tracks. So here's a hand coming downwards. You can see the fingertips. You can even see the creases in the skin. It almost looks like Mickey Mouse got caught under some sediment. You see a second hand here where you don't see the hand so much as you do the fingertips, these cone-shaped fingertips. And then you have a third hand here that's a little blurred in this picture, but it's coming out the other direction and a little more three-dimensionally. In addition to this, and notice the scale is 2 centimeters. So this is, again, very small tracks, but Even smaller, we have an assortment of different kinds of invertebrate tracks and trails going across the sediment. So the level of preservation at this size, this range, is just extraordinary. Here's another track, and this is we have far better detailed tracks, but this is an important track to kind of give you an idea of associated information that we get in addition to just a track. So here you see this 5-digit PEZ with these toes that come off, or claws, excuse me, that come off the toes at this strange angle. It's very diagnostic of this group. Um, but if you notice, there's also these very thin lines that are coming up, and these are the toe drags as it's walking. So as it leaves this spot and starts walking forward, these toes will drag and they leave traces. We also, something that's kind of hidden, we don't pay attention to at first, here is the manus to that hand. Much smaller in size, but you can see here's the actual digits up here on the left. So there's a lot of story to this, and this is one of the advantages of when it comes to body fossils versus trace fossils. A body fossil is just there. We know what the maker is. We have almost the opposite problem when it comes to trace fossils and body fossils. We don't always necessarily know exactly who the maker is, but we know what's going on and where they're at. Um, Here's another perspective on scale and preservation. On the top right here, you can see this is a millimeter scale. Here's a track with the digits. And if you look closely, you'll even see that there's nail marks coming off from the claws of this small creature. Um, this is not our smallest track. We actually have another species that's that's even quite a bit smaller than this, believe it or not, and is equal to the smallest known fossil vertebrate tracks. Um, and again, on the other scale of the thing, I don't think we necessarily have an image in here of our biggest, but on the other end of it, we're looking at about a softball glove size. Now, here's more examples. If you notice, there's a wide range of colors you're seeing here, and this is real for the most part. This one on the bottom right, we just colored it black and white, and sometimes you'll see the photos in here are black and white. That's just for contrast to help you see something better. But there is a wide range of hues of this burgundy to closer to a brown. This is what we see in the rocks. Now, when it comes to trying to figure out who's who's the vertebrates that were represented here, it's very difficult to make a direct association with a track. And we have certain principles in ichnology, in the study of trace fossils, that we try not to definitively say or assign a maker to a track. And that's because many animals can make similar tracks, and sometimes different animals using different behaviors can make the same track. The other problem is that at this site, we have mostly trace fossils. So we don't have body fossils that we can try to compare and see what we think would have fit this trace or that trace. In addition, most vertebrate fossils from this time period, they're missing a lot of times their feet and their hands in the fossil record. So it's really difficult to try to assign who's who. However, we can look at the greater general um, aspects and morphologies of these. Like we can see that they have these circular um, pads on the end of their toes, or we might see this very distinctive straight heel and the shape of these digits here to cells it's a synapsid, things like this. So we are able to kind of get an idea of what groups are represented in here, representative at the site, but we can't say with any real, we can't tell you what species made this particular track. The animals, the specimens you see on the bottom are examples of something that would make similar tracks, but we're not saying necessarily those are what's here. But you can see that we have um, this representative group of different vertebrates. We also have this is also going to be we also have other behaviors that are seen that are not just walking um, from vertebrates. And this is one of them. This is kind of a strange one, and it's going to be hard to tell what's going on. So bear with me. Believe me what I'm telling you. But this on this side and this on this side are both feet. What you see down here is a partial handprint, and then you see 2 feet, and you see this, it's actually squatting. Now, it may not, in these series of lines are part of the tail that's actually curving up. So it may not, this is very unusual. We have dinosaur squatting tracks in the Triassic, but it's very unusual to find squatting tracks. But they have this representative kind of V shape that comes back from the back end where it's sitting or doing whatever it's doing. It's also possible that this thing's not technically squatting, that maybe it's actually climbing with its front legs and it's causing its back end to make a impression. But the point is that we are able to, again, grab stories and kind of pull together with these facts other things that are happening, not just um, vertebrates walking across the surface. The same way that we also have swimming vertebrates. So we have examples in very specific parts of the site. We have examples where we're able to recover indigna or swimming traces. And so these are traces that are made by the tail making an impression as the fish is swimming along the bottom. So this tells us that at the very least, we had areas of standing water for some amount of time. We don't have traditional lake-like deposits where we're actually seeing uh, an established lake, but this is ongoing, trying to figure out where these guys are coming from. But we do know that they exist. Down here, it's a lot more complicated and difficult to see. Maybe it's best to see here on this far left where it gets a little less tangled up. But you see these two parallel lines. You have one is going this way, one is following this side. That's from the pectoral fins that are making an impression. And then crossing, you have this kind of sinusoidal line, and that's from the tail. So here's a different species of fish that has pectoral fins that make contact, and then you see the actual tail. On the right-hand side, we see one of these tetrapods swimming, and that's represented here by these long nail scratches that are sinusoidal in nature as well as the animal's moving its limbs. But we only see the nails making contact. Um, and so that tells us that this was a swimming vertebrate. So again, the vertebrate, I should say too, before completely leaving the vertebrate tracks and trails, is that we have an enormous amount of them, and they're probably one of the most dominant fossils that we have at the site. But really, the key to understanding them further and our next stage of development, understanding those, will be going in and getting these massive bedding planes where we can actually examine their stride and stuff like this, which is really needed for the diagnostic part to kind of narrow it down. But now we're going to go into invertebrates, and invertebrates at this site are really valuable. Um, and it's probably the most important part fossil-wise of this whole site in terms of its importance. And that's because hexapods at this time are just beginning their their radiation. So a lot of the groups that we know of today that are well established haven't started yet. With their stem members are just starting to evolve. Um, Even groups that we do know that have started are just beginning. So we're really early in the record of insects and hexapods. And if we think about the fossil record of insects, the first insect is found in the Devonian. After the Devonian, there's no insects. There's the hexapod gap, which Romer's gap is in the middle of and is far smaller. But the hexapod gap is really huge. We don't see another insect again until number 2 here. And that's our first example of a flying insect. So somewhere between non-flying insects at number 1 and flying insects at number two. Major things happened, but we have zero evidence of it. We can't find a single record. And people have looked, and there's all kinds of explanations for this, um, proposed explanations for it, but it's a big mystery. But this is, again, going back to the Wamsutta Formation, this is really important because we are extreme. The difference between number two and us is only 3 million years. And so the first appearance of wings is at number two. We have 3 million years before we show up. There is not much in the fossil record in between two and the Wamsutta Formation. And what there is primarily, it primarily exists in wing fossils. Wing fossils, and this happens even after the Wamsutta Formation. A lot of what we know about when it comes to bodies of insects is pretty much their wings and the venation. There are probably a maximum of 10 body fossils with fragments or full wing or full bodies, but with or fragments between number two and us. And and so the venation is the thing that we are able to define the evolution of insects on, um, but we don't know what their actual bodies look like for the most part. In the Wamsutta Formation, we do have impressions of wings. And again, remember, we keep talking about trace fossils. So this is an example of a body fossil, even though it's an impression, um, because it's just an impressed part of a body. So we don't have many wing impressions in our site, uh, but we do have them. And and again, this is really what most people work on at the time for insects. What we do have that's extraordinarily rare are full body impressions of living insects. So we almost have, again, we have kind of a reversal problem. We don't have the wings, but we got the bodies. And even of winged insects, because the wings are often not in contact with the substrate. So um, we're going to talk about both of these a little bit more in example, but let's talk about what are full body impressions. So full body impressions, and this is really an evolving category from the Wamsutta because in the whole world, there's only 10 known examples, 10 specimens, individual specimens that are recorded uh, of living insects. And you can see them pictured here. When you're looking at the Carboniferous, 3 out of 4 of these are from this formation. The fourth one is from a formation in the Rhode Island Formation, which is right next door, which is associated with this. Um, and we define full body impressions as ventral anatomy of low body animals like insects that are preserved in these substrates. Um, they have to be alive while they're made. That's a big difference. If there's no way to show it's alive, we would call it a body fossil. And if you think about what kind of conditions it would take to make a full body impression of something like a dragonfly, first of all, how do you get it to make contact with the substrate with this entire body? But how is it heavy enough to actually make really good detail of that body? And how is it going to do it so well that when it leaves, it doesn't actually disturb it either? So it's a really extraordinary thing in the creation of these, and they're very rare as a result. Now, just to talk a little bit more about this, explain the difference. On the left is a full body impression of a dead insect, and this is from roughly the same time period in Joggins Formation. And we know it's dead because we look at the body here and you can see that the abdomen is off at an angle. It's not in a lifelike position. We can see that all 4 wings are fully in the substrate, and deeply impressed at that. And we don't see any type of movement. We don't see the animal struggling to get out. Um, there's nothing that indicates that. And there is detail. So because this doesn't show any movement, this terms it a body fossil. It's given a body fossil name. It's included in the body fossil record of insects. when they do phylogenies and studies. On the right-hand side here, we have a full body impression of a naiad, a nymph form of from the Wamsutta Formation. Now, this animal is made while it's alive. If we look at the differences, it's in life position, and we know this because, first of all, look at the legs. If you actually carefully follow them out, it comes out to the full extension here, and we can see that with all the legs. Also notice that there's a gap here in the leg where there is no impression, and that's because it's sitting on the surface. That joint is not in contact with the actual substrate. We also can see this back leg made a kind of a swoosh here for whatever reason when it was coming in. You can see some gills coming off the abdomen here, which gives us again the sense that this is not an adult form of insect. Uh, and what it has here too is a labial mask, which is something that young juvenile dragonflies, for example, have. And it acts like an arm and shoots out and grabs prey. But um, because this is a trace fossil, this cannot be given a body fossil name. Instead, it's given a trace fossil name. And trace fossils, because they don't like to line up exactly, um, because trace fossils don't like to name the trace after the individual because of their rules, it gets lost, and this will not actually be used in the insect literature along to record the evolution of insects. Um, so anyway, but you can see there's obviously a lot of detail, and the detail preserves, unfortunately, the ventral side of the insects, and that makes it very difficult to identify because also a lot of times there's not details on the ventral side to identify them. I see that there's not a lot of time left here, so I'm going to speed up a little faster. These are archaeognathans. They're a type of detritivore that's still alive today and relatively the same anatomically. And these are very dominant at the site in terms of full body impressions. There are only non-winged hexapod that we have at the site. These are also found at other Carboniferous sites in Kansas and Indiana and New Mexico. So, but we have a different species here, and you can see it in the left. Here's again its ventral view. Here's its telson. And these guys walk, and they also will jump and do other behaviors. And here's an example of that. Here's the actual anatomy of the ventral side. Here you can actually see impressions made by its palp, but these guys jump, as I told you. And so every single little yellow arrow you see here is one of these full body impressions. And so you can actually watch them jumping across the surface. And this is extraordinarily small. And when we found this rock, we did not find it for this. It was for something else. And it was only examining the rock that this was discovered. And that happens a lot at this site because trace fossils require unique lighting, oftentimes to make them pop up, to recognize them. And as you know, working in the field, these rocks are dirty and you're bringing out stuff. You do the best you can. We also have found nymphs. This is the oldest insect nymph found on the planet. And this is, it's very rough to see here, but it's a rhoichoid type of nymph, which is the nymph of a Paleodictyopteran, which are the beaked insects that used to exist at this time. They had a third set of kind of wing-like structures by the head. They were a very unique group. But this is also a trace fossil. These little lines coming off here are actually leg impressions. And this is the first time in the fossil record that we have a nymph behavior, not just a nymph body. We also, and our first discovery ever of these things was an ephemeropteran, a mayfly, or a stem group mayfly, I should say, but it's a full body impression. And again, it had the characteristic double movement of the legs. We can actually see overlapping. We can see details of spines of these hairs dragging off the back of the leg. And again, notice the missing parts of the legs where you actually have it sitting in life position as it was. But we have tons of full body impressions that are coming out. Here's another flying insect. You can actually see one leg that comes down this way, a second one goes this way. Here's a full wing that's impressed from this, and this is um, actually as a result we think of actually being preyed upon while it was there. It's kind of not included here, but there's actually a vertebrate hand that's actually stepping on that wing, and we actually can see that the body widens in its oppression and rolls to the right, right where the wing is. So we think it was stepped on, and you actually see this kind of roll of the body. Um, and then on the right hand side here, we see another one of those archaeognathans, the guys who jump, but this guy landed sideways. And you can see all of his leg movements as he's stuck in the mud on the side. So we have tons of these in different sizes and shapes and varieties. And so this is for the first time really letting us know what the anatomy of these insects look like. But again, it's a little challenging. How do we categorize these uh, when we don't have the wings, which is what everyone else is using to kind of to kind of place these guys? Um, we also have full body impressions or some impressions of other unique groups like limulus, freshwater horseshoe crabs. Back in those days, they had these. It was very common in lakes and waterways to have freshwater limulids. There's even an idea that they may have been able to exist in really damp, humid environments like leaf litter. But we have them here. Here's the Telson of one in the kind of shield. Here's the actual bumpy head shield of one of them as well. And it again gives us some kind of indication, like the fish trails did, that there must have been some standing water, at least for some period of time or somewhere close by that we just haven't fully run into yet. Um, we also have arachnid full body impressions, which is even more extraordinarily rare. This here, I apologize if it's difficult to see. I've stared at this thing for so long that I forget what it looks like when you're looking at it for the first time. Uh, and it might be easier to point out this, but here's what they look like today. They haven't changed at all, really, in their morphology. And here we have a full body impression of one, including trackways of it walking up to its place and a time movement of one of the limbs. So again, it lets us know that this thing was alive, at least when it got in place. We don't know if it died in that spot or what, but we do know that it was living, it was made, it was in life position, and we have a trackway. On the bottom left here, we have what's called a raciniulid, which is a very specialized. Their common name is hooded tick spiders because they look like ticks. They're alive today. They're a very rare group that not a lot is known about, including we don't know how they molt in today. We've never seen them molt. Uh, we think that this up on the top left is not, we know it's a raciniulid, but we think it's actually a molt. So that would make this a body fossil. You can see this kind of headpiece here is missing. It's off the screen. It would be further away on the rock. We see that piece and we see an impression of a newly molted one of these guys. So this here, where you have a leg here, a leg coming up, right? We think that this is actually a molt, but it's the first time that it would be the first time we had a molt's ever recorded in the history of these animals. As far as the whip scorpion, this is only the second time any of these have ever been found um, in this hemisphere. And it's the ninth species that's ever been found of this group worldwide in the Paleozoic. So, okay, I'm really running out of time. I'm going to go fast with the plants. Um, so, as he discussed, the plants were studied in 1944 originally, and that guy never reposited his collection into a museum, so that collection was lost. Lyons and Sproul did the study in 2018, came up with 22 species. They also formally have passed, and they didn't reposit their specimens in a collection either. Um, so I'm just going to show you some pictures quick of these plants to give you some kind of idea of what kind of detail we're talking about. And remember, these are all impressions. There's no original material. But however, if you look, we can actually see scars and traces that are still preserved. So that the level of detail is fantastic, even without the original material. Um, for example, on this bark. And we even have spots where we have tree stumps in place, in situ. Um, Here's an example of a larger one. Here's a smaller one. Um, this is about 8 inches across. So there's a lot here. We went back, we looked, we were able to recover 131 morphospecies. And because plants are so fragmented in the Paleozoic and we can't tell necessarily what comes with what, something like a stem, a root, and a seed of the same tree can be given different names for each single one. So um, we call them morphospecies. But if we just look distinctively at the foliage, we have 83 different species of foliage. So that gives us probably a more accurate idea of how many different plants are going on. And the previous idea was that these were xeromorphic or dry loving plants. And we found that that was true, but that there was also areas of really water loving plants and plants, of course, that kind of are in the middle. Um, we, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because of the time that's left, but we did do rarefaction curves, which is a method where we can plug in what we've been finding and see where we're at in terms of how much more could we expect to find, or are we at a point where we found the bulk of the stuff? If we keep looking, we start finding just the rarities. And the important line here is the orange. You can see that we are kind of starting to flatten out a lot of these curves, if not already flat. And so it tells us that, yeah, we could probably find a couple more species if we keep going, but that we've really kind of found the bulk in a lot of cases. And again, to point out the um, enormous detail that's preserved in these Paleozoic plants uh, allows us to go to the next step, which is to see actual plant insect damage on the plants. So here in A, we have a fossil gall, which is where a insect has irritated a plant. The plant responds by making a growth, and the insect uses that growth to feed and protect its larvae, which will live inside. We've got well over a dozen of these. It's the only time, it's the second time we see this in the fossil record. The first time we see it is in the late Devonian. There's a big gap, and this is the second occurrence of this in the fossil record. So it's really important that we see this. We also have this weird comma shape on here in B, and this is uh, an oviposition mark where an insect has laid an egg. It cuts, makes a slice in the plant, it inserts an egg, and we can, um, and this is the first time in the fossil record that we see that, which is a really big deal. And down here in C, we have piercing and sucking scars. You can see them lined up vertically, and that's most likely from that group we were talking about earlier, the Paleodictyopteran, with those real long beaked stylets. In D, we also have, in addition to plant insect stuff, we're actually able to see other things like spores, well, impressions. We also get stuff like this. This is a Cordytes leaf here. You see all this weird kind of veiny looking stuff going across of it. Those are fungal rhizomorphs, and they're invading the dead plant, and they will actually, here's the plant here in silver, and here's the matrix. You can actually watch it run across from the plant into the matrix. And we even have pieces of matrix without the plants where you just see these networking rhizomorphs going all over the place. And then they are really associated strongly with these Chordites leaves. And we think that this might have been a way that nutrients and water were transported around that area to support some of these plants that were further away from water than they normally are. Um, excuse me, sorry. And if we take all this all together and we compare it to all the other um, Carboniferous Lagerstätten of the time period, body fossil and trace fossil, we see it's right up there in what it's preserving. It, uh, it's really diverse in vertebrates, invertebrates, and plants. And it's again, it's probably its greatest and the plant insect interactions, which is a feature you can only get primarily from trace fossils. So that gives us an advantage. But the invertebrates are really probably the most important group that's going on here. When we take this group and we apply it to other trace fossil sites of the same time period, of the same environment, the interpreted environment, we find that this particular formation is also extraordinarily more diverse than the majority. Um, now, I'll just sum this up by saying, is this unique? In some ways, yes, we showed you the uniqueness of all the invertebrate full body impressions, but we don't think it's actually unique in reality. We think that people just aren't recognizing these full body impressions or looking for these things, and that the more people go back and really focus on this, the more that will be found, and so that this graph may look more straight across and really, the key is by looking at this stuff, we can, especially like the FBI's, we can start to recognize hidden diversity that would otherwise be lost to the fossil record. And so I apologize for for being a little long-winded in that last part, but thank you.
Go with it. Yeah, it'll be easier if you do, then they'll hear you.
Hi, I've got a quick question for you.
Sure.
Have you guys done any of this ichthyofossil, or do you know if anyone's done this kind of ichthyofossil insect checking on the Union Chapel stuff?
Yeah, I think that stuff's really well studied, and I think that the environment too might be hard for the insects, but I don't think there's the only insect stuff I know there are like tracks and trails, but not the full body impression stuff. Um, what about you, Jake?
I would just say that I know some of the people who've worked on the Union Chapel stuff, and they're very experienced trace fossil experts, and I believe they would have seen it if it were present.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Any other questions? We got one coming.
The one Manus print you showed looked very different in size from the Pest print. Do you have I've ascended. Do you have any evidence of bipedalism, facultative or otherwise, among these tetrapods that has been proposed for things like bolosaurids in this age interval?
I would point you beyond that track pair that you mentioned to the one that appears to be squatting, which is an interesting potential incidence of facultative bipedalism. We do see some very clear track ways with Manus pest pairs that have significant size differentiation. Again, really difficult to link these to exact body fossils, but I tend to drift in that direction, that there could be some sort of bipedalism by, whenever the organism might need it. Perhaps if you're in a wooded area or vegetated area, it might make sense to sit up on your hind limbs and reach up into a plant, something like that.
All right, thank you very much.
Hi, I was wondering, the matrix looked like it was a fairly fine sediment. Is that a real fine sediment that you're working with here?
Yeah, I don't know if RJ could go back to one of those pictures of the rocks, but the the very thin mudstone caps of
Okay.
sandstone units.
Yeah,
We're
yeah.
talking the mudstone that you see there in the bottom right and even the top left.
Uh-huh.
That is very fine sediment, and it's the result of settling from suspension in these pools near the bases of these alluvial fans.
Okay.
Sometimes, however, we do find like the two specimens you see in the top right, those two specimens are actually very fine sand, like very fine sand.
Oh, okay.
So you will
Okay.
find them occasionally in the very fine sand, but really the majority of the insect traces you'll find in the mudstone. The a lot of the
Mudstones.
vertebrate
Okay.
tracks are actually under tracks, and they'll go through the mud into the sand, and we'll see those under track impressions in the sand.
Okay. Now, and I'm a paleobotanist. On the plant material, did you find any cuticle on that, or was it looked to me like all of those were impressions rather than uh, compressions? Is that pretty much what you were finding?
Yeah, almost all of it, unfortunately.
No, no cuticle at all.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Any casts that you were finding, or was it mostly impressions?
Mostly impressions, with the I think there's some Calamites casts
Yeah,
that we
we've had
found, but
Yeah.
we've had
Yeah.
calamites casts.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that would be.
And
Yeah,
the few stump casts that he had in that
yeah.
presentation,
Okay.
but
Yeah.
there's no detail we've been able to excavate on the external parts of those casts.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, the stuff looks fascinating. So, okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, we certainly appreciate your taking time out of your schedules to speak to us today. This was really interesting. I actually lived in New England and went to school in Boston, and if I had known this stuff was there, I never would have gone to class. So,
I hear that.
so anyway, thank you again, and we really appreciate everything that you've shared with us today.
Great. Thanks, Terry. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for having us. Thanks for braving the weather.
Mhm.